Hi everybody, today I'm in my tea shop in Pu'er City. We're in the middle of the night and I'm gonna brew 4 different oolong teas for you. I have to shoot this video at night because there's a lot of construction going on around during the day, so that would make it too noisy. So sorry in advance for the poor lighting. I will try to fix this for the future videos. So it's quite a special tea that I'd like to share with you today. When we say oolong tea, we typically think of Fujian and Taiwan, but these 4 teas come from Ailao Shan. Ailao Shan is in the middle of Yunnan. It's one of the 2 big mountains that cross Yunnan diagonally from Dali to the Vietnamese border, and it's parallel to Wuliangshan. So these 2 mountains form a landmark if you look at satellite pictures of Yunnan. They are right in the middle. At the end of last year, at the end of 2020, we took a trip and we wanted to explore Jingdong area. So Jingdong is the town that's located in the middle of Wuliangshan and Ailao Shan. And so we drove there and we didn't have any specific idea in mind. And a friend of mine told me there was that Taiwanese guy who grew oolong tea on Ailao Shan. So we decided to just go have a look. And what was supposed to be a day trip ended up being like 3 days in the mountain. And we were absolutely delighted with this trip. And that's why I'd like to introduce these teas to you today. So I'm going to talk and brew the tea at the same time, which is quite a challenge because usually oolong tea can be somewhat tricky to brew. You don't want to miss it. I think it's a bit more demanding than pu'er tea. But anyway, let's go. So we have 4 teas. We have, these are like Gaoshan oolong style. The kinds you would find in Alishan or Lishan in Taiwan. Pretty typical Taiwanese tea. You could also say it's quite like Tie Guanyin. This one is roasted Gaoshan oolong, so it's the same processing but there's roasting added. And this one is a Dongfang Meizhen, an Oriental beauty. So I'm going to go over each of these teas. I'm going to first brew these 2 teas because they are very similar and I want to explore their differences. So let's go. So we drove up the mountain. It's Jingdong is an absolutely beautiful area. So it's stuck between 2 high mountains, Wuliang and Ailao. So we went to the northeast to Ailao and we started climbing the mountain. The landscape there is quite dramatic. You have large altitude differences. Jingdong is it's in the valley, it's on a plateau, and Ailao Shan goes up to maybe 3,000 meters if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, we drove, and so Ailao Shan, on the top of Ailao Shan, it's a large natural reserve, a national park. We went to a place called Dujianhu, so it's a lake. Yeah, it's a lake that's near the national reserve. We drove there for about 2 hours, and then the road was too small. We entered the national park and we took a walk, and then there we came across oolong tea plantations that were growing inside the park. Actually, that was quite unusual because usually those areas are totally protected. You have national parks like on eastern Yiwu. You have one in Bulangshan, for example. You have one in Mongsong. And they typically only have forest. And so we were quite surprised to find these oolong tea plantations, what seemed to be Qing Xin Oolong. So we gathered more information and eventually we found that the factory that owns the tea gardens and processes the tea. And we met a really nice guy there. So I'm not going to rinse the tea. I think it's not necessary for oolong tea, because I think it would be like wasting the first brew. You just brew until you see the leaves open up, unfold a bit. I like to brew them quite strong, but it depends on the fragrance you like to get in the mouthfeel. And so we went to this factory and we met Mr. Huang. Mr. Huang is from Taiwan. He arrived 25 years ago. He arrived in 1994, which kind of surprised us. There aren't that many Taiwanese people in Yunnan. I just know a few. All of them are in the tea business, of course. And so we started talking, and it turned out that this guy was really passionating and also very inspirational, because he told us his story and he didn't have a very easy time setting up this business. So I'm going to tell you a bit about his story first. He was a sailor before doing the tea business, and then he wanted to retire from being on the sea. He wanted to be in the mountain. So that was 1993. And in 1993, so he had that plan of growing oolong tea, but he didn't like the way oolong tea was grown in Taiwan, because usually, the Taiwanese tea industry, a lot of places are not very sustainable. They will use quite a lot of pesticide and fertilizers, and I won't go into details in the Taiwanese industry, but basically it's quite unsustainable. They always rely on young trees, so they don't have many very old trees there. They tend to replant every now and then, and they like to do it on untouched ground. And this was a bit like Mr. Huang didn't like this. He wanted to grow his oolong tea in a sustainable way. So he wanted to make actually organic oolong tea, which is pretty rare on the market. You can find a lot of organic pu'er tea, even though it's not certified. But growing oolong tea without pesticides and chemical fertilizers proves to be a challenge, and I'm going to explain you why. And so Mr. Huang wanted to grow that organic tea, and so he looked at China. At that time, there was a policy that would encourage the Taiwanese businessmen to set up businesses in China. So in the 90s, it was a time when the relations between mainland China and Taiwan was a bit better. And so they encouraged these businessmen to bring the know-how from Taiwan and set up businesses. So he took up this opportunity and he got in touch with many officials, and he got to travel a lot around China. So he explored many areas. He traveled for months, and eventually he found that area, Dujuanhu, so the Dujuan Lake, quite far in Ailao Mountain. And so it took us 2 hours to drive there, but at that time it was probably 6 hours because the roads were very bad. We were in 1993. And that's where he wanted to set up his tea factory and his tea plantations. But it proved to be a major challenge because it was a protected area. And so he lobbied a lot the local government. He made a lot of contacts, and he went very high in the Chinese government hierarchy, and eventually, thanks to his determination probably, he managed to get the permit to set up his tea plantations. So he set up 7 hectares of Qing Xin Oolong, 7 hectares of Qing Xin Oolong in the natural reserve. The deal is at that time there were many economic and social problems in those villages, so the government was very eager on providing employment in those areas, and that's how, with a lot of negotiation, he managed to establish these plantations there. So the first challenge was just going through the red tape, the administrative part. But then came up a bigger challenge. So he imported cuttings from Taiwan of the original Qing Xin Oolong. So Qing Xin Oolong is it's a cultivar, so you have to use cuttings to propagate it. You cannot use seeds. And well, it turned out that in 1994 he planted his tea trees. And the first year, most of the tea trees died during the winter because of the frost. I haven't mentioned it yet, but it's a very high altitude area. His tea trees grow at 2,500, 2,600 meters of elevation. So it's as high as the highest places where you can find tea in Taiwan. So you could say that it was a failure, but he saw success in that because a few of the tea trees survived. So he kept replanting, actually, he kept replacing the attrition, you could say, over the years. And eventually he managed to establish good plantations. What you have to understand is that the tea trees are particularly vulnerable to frost when they are young. Once they cross like 5 years old, then it's less likely that they will die. Okay, they need to form a thicker layer of leaves, and then you will probably have a kind of microclimate beyond the tea trees, because you have that carpet of leaves that will mitigate the low temperature, and probably also due to just having a healthier system. When the tea trees is over 5 years old, you will have more survival. The tea trees can take more punishment. Then his next challenge was to export to Taiwan. Again, that's a lot of administrative work. This is work we do as well, so we know well how tricky that can be with all the paperwork. But he didn't have any problem on the sales side. I asked him, like, how would the Taiwanese perceive tea from oolong tea made in Yunnan? Because in Taiwan, well, would it be seen as fake tea, maybe, or as an ersatz of Taiwanese oolong tea? Because, you know, a lot of Taiwanese oolongs are actually produced in Indonesia, in Vietnam, some in Thailand too, and usually they are considered as lower grade, even though even in Taiwan there's a lot of mislabeling in this industry. And well, I was surprised, but he told me no, that there was no problem, because the main selling point of his tea, well, there were two selling points actually. The first was that he was organic, and he has all the paperwork, so he is an administrative expert, because having an organic certification in China for tea is very complicated. It's a very thorough process with many details. So he got that organic certification for the oolong teas, and interestingly, the Qing Xin Oolong that grows in Ailao Shan displays a very different character, very different from what you can find in Taiwan. And that's what I'm drinking now. So I'm going to talk a bit about those two teas now. Well, what surprised me, honestly, I was not impressed at the first sip with these teas, because the fragrance is not as fancy as the good Taiwanese teas you can find in Taiwan. I spent 6 months in Taiwan as an exchange student, so I got to drink a lot of Taiwanese tea, And usually you can find teas that will really blow your mind just by smelling the leaves. And this is not the case for those teas. Of course, they have a pleasant fragrance, but it's not overly fancy, like you'd find in high-quality Taiwanese tea. But you get to understand the quality of these teas over the session. I found them exceptionally long brewing, and they display a very good mouthfeel. The kind of mouthfeel that a poor tea drinker would enjoy, actually. And so I was quite surprised. You have that kind of Yunnan poor tea personality that's added in this oolong tea. So I must say I've never had an oolong like these. Usually oolong tends to be enjoyed over maybe 5 brews, but with these teas you can go to 10 brews, no problem. And they behave a bit like a pu'er tea, I would say. With, okay, you get a good fragrance, but the story is really in the mouth, you know. So you get some bitterness if you brew strong, and then you get the sweetness. And it's quite rare, actually, I think, to have that kind of sweetness in a lowly oxidized oolong tea. So I was quite impressed by this. Actually, I kind of like these teas, I must tell you. And the fact that they are organic. So he told me that, and I was told by many other people that the key to having a good fragrance in oolong tea is fertilization. Okay, you have to feed your tea trees with lots of nutrients. And the problem is, if you don't use chemical fertilizer, it's very hard to provide that amount of nutrients. Okay, because chemical fertilizer is like typically 30% pure nitrogen, while if you use a mulch or if you use compost, you'll be around 5% pure nitrogen. So you have to apply a lot more of compost, or you have to apply a lot more of organic fertilizer to get the same amount of nutrients. Or you have to find non-chemical mineral fertilizer, but it's pretty hard to find nowadays, this kind of stuff. Yeah, especially for nitrogen. So that was another challenge that Mr. Huang had, because in any case you need to fertilize a lot these tea gardens. So he would first get that basic like the cow manure, pig manure, and compost, but it wasn't enough for Mr. Huang. He has kind of an engineering mind, so he developed a method, a special method of producing his organic fertilizer. So his organic fertilizer complies with the restrictions, the requirements of the organic label, but he's able to make a stronger fertilizer. So he holds a patent for this, and I haven't gone into many details, but he has a fertilizer processing factory in Jingdong, and he set it up specifically to fertilize his tea gardens. So I think it involves doing some compost and then applying heat treatment, things like that, to kind of concentrate the nutrients and have a punchier fertilizer while complying with the organic label requirements. And he also sells his fertilizer to other farmers, but he started it mainly for his own tea gardens. So we had a lot of tea, and then we had great food with the locals because the specialty there is ham. It's a high altitude area. It's very dry and cold, and it's a perfect place to dry ham. So we spent an evening in a farm eating below all the sausages and the hams, the big hams hanging on the wall, and that's great memories actually. That's also part of the tea experience and why I love looking for tea. And on the next day, we took a more extensive trip around his tea plantations because, of course, since it's a national reserve, they had to really be respectful of the environment. So, unfortunately, well, they destroyed some pieces of forests. Now it's only 7 hectares, but they dispatched the tea gardens in order to still preserve the biodiversity. And the control is quite stringent because actually they have an ecology research center there because it's a very kind of a very unique ecosystem you get there. It's Yunnan, but it's very high altitude, and when you walk in the forest, it reminded me of Sweden actually. You have the main cover is not grass, it's actually moss, just like in Sweden, so you can walk, it feels like walking on a pillow, you have that moss that's filled with water. And the air is also very pure because that's a place where they're going to build one of the largest observatories, for the stars. And indeed, you can see the stars very clearly at night. So that's how good the environment quality is there. There's no ambient light at all because Jingdong city, even though it's not so far as the crow flies, it's hidden by a ridge. It's hidden by a tall mountain. So yeah, this was probably the best hiking I had in 2020. Really, not that I did much hiking in 2020, honestly. We're gonna go on the second brew for these teas. So I'm gonna talk about these 2 teas because these 2 teas, they are both from spring 2020 and they're gonna be available on our website, just like these 2 others. Now these 2 teas, so they are Qing Xin Oolong. The difference is this one has a lighter oxidation and it uses a slightly higher grade. Okay, so you could say basically that this one has the flowery type, and this one is the fruity type. At the first tasting, I preferred the one with lower grade and slightly higher oxidation, but as I drink them more and more every day, well, it's kind of, I really like both now. They just have a different personality. And I think the difference in fragrance comes out even better when you brew them light. That's something funny that I found out with fragrance. It doesn't get better when you brew it strong, okay? Of course, when you brew strong, you get a stronger mouthfeel, but you don't necessarily get a more powerful fragrance. And yeah, what really impresses me with these teas is that you get an incredible mouthfeel, in my opinion, as far as this type of tea goes. And you even get a tiny bit of Huigan, which is rare. I think I can only think of Yancha Wui Shan tea, in which you also can get intense Huigan. But I must say, it's one of the rare times when I've had Huigan with Gaosancha. And yeah, they taste natural. It's the kind of tea I have one every day, actually. I don't get tired of those two teas. And it's interesting because usually I very much enjoy having one session with a good Taiwanese tea, but usually I wouldn't have it every day, or I wouldn't have 5 oolong teas in a row, because they tend to be hard on the stomach and make you tea drunk in a bad way, just not like pu'er tea. Now maybe it's just because I'm not used to drinking that much oolong tea, but I've always felt okay with these teas from Ailao San. And so yeah, they sold pretty well in Taiwan because so there was that high demand in Taiwan because they are grown in a pristine environment. Now the problems started. So he had quite a thriving business for over 20 years. He upgraded his factory, of course, and he extended slightly his tea plantations. He also makes pu'er tea, but we're going to keep focused on the oolong tea today. And in 2019, problems started arising. As you know, the relations between mainland China and Taiwan are not at their best. They are quite bad actually nowadays. And so the Taiwanese government decided to prohibit the imports of Chinese tea, as I understand. So now it's very hard, well, it seems that it's impossible in 2020 for Mr. Huang to legally export his teas in Taiwan. And so legally, so you could think, okay, you can have under the table exports, like it's very often done in the tea business, but the problem is he has his organic certification, and if he wants to export with the organic certification, he has to do all the paperwork and export legally. So now his business has stalled because all of his customers were in Taiwan, and he's now stuck. He has 7 tons of tea that he made this year, and that he's not able to sell, despite having his Taiwanese customers asking for it. And so that's a good consideration when you do business. You have to think about those long-term risks, or it's part of the risks of the business, and it can seem like it's thriving, and then one crisis pushes you to change your business model. So from this year on, Mr. Huang is trying to find other sales channels. He wants to promote his teas more in mainland China and maybe in other countries. And so that's why we're going to sell his teas and see how they fetch on the international market. I hope you will like them, because I think they have quite a good typicity, really. Great characteristics. So I'm just gonna go quickly on the oolong tea processing, and take all what I say with a pinch of salt, because I've seen the tea processing. Mr. Huang has explained it to me. I saw it in Taiwan, but I've never done it myself, so I'm not really an expert at oolong tea processing. So this is how it goes. You harvest the leaves, then you're going to lay them on mattresses in the sun. So you're going to give them a sun withering. That will allow the leaves to get softer quite quickly. And at this step, you're going to lose about 15% of the water content. Then you're going to shade. You're going to wither in the shade, just like we do with pu'er tea. Okay, so first sun withering, then shade withering. Then you're going to do the bruising. So you have a tumbler. It's called a Yauching. You bruise the leaves by having them fall. You can also do it on a flat bamboo basket. It's more time consuming. I think Mr. Huang does it in a tumbler. So the purpose is to bruise the leaves and start the oxidation. And this oxidation will be more prevalent on the sides of the leaves because they break more easily. So you do that bruising. It takes a couple of minutes. It's not a very long process. And once the leaves are bruised, you're going to wither them again in the shade on flat bamboo baskets. You're going to wait for a couple of hours, and your leaves are going to turn dark. They're going to oxidize. Not all of the leaves, not all parts of the leaves, mainly the sides. And that's how you get kind of a specific fragrance with that. We actually do that with some black teas sometimes. Once you get the degree of oxidation that you like, you do the shaching. That's going to be a complete shaching. You want to destroy all of the enzymes. So that's going to be a high temperature shaching with a pretty short time because you don't want to degrade the components in the leaves too much. So high temperature, short time in a shaching machine. The leaves come out, the enzymes are deactivated, so your tea will stop oxidizing. Then you're gonna start rolling, and that's the most tedious part of oolong tea processing. You're gonna do so. You put the leaves in a cloth, in a big piece of cloth. You're gonna make a ball with it. You roll it very tightly, put it in a machine, have it turn like this. So it's going to turn for a couple of minutes, and then you stop the machine, you unpack the leaves, you unpack the cloth, and then you have to kind of spread the leaves, okay? Spread the leaves. Then you repack them in the cloth, put it again in the machine, and then you roll again, and you do that again and again, and you do that all night. So one batch is going to be rolled and spread for maybe 20 to 30 times, and that's how you're going to get those tiny ball-shaped leaves. So it's extremely tedious. So the processing for oolong tea is kind of is much more work than for pu'er tea. Okay, then you've done the rolling. Then it's pretty straightforward. You just dry the leaves with hot air. So it can be a continuous dryer, or it can be a batch dryer. Of course, again, you have to check the temperature and things, but it's very much like black tea. And then that's about it. You can add a roasting step if you want. That's optional. You can also kind of do that roasting step just by increasing the drying temperature. Okay, so yeah, that roasting step can also be just like we do in black tea. You can add a little light roast taste during the drying, or you can do a separate like charcoal roasting. So oolong tea is still the most complicated processing. Okay, so let me repeat again the steps. Sun withering, shade withering, bruising, withering, shade withering, shaching, rolling, drying, and roasting, optionally. Okay, so that's many more steps and a lot more time in the factory than for pu'er tea or black tea. But so it's quite impressive, and I like to talk about oolong tea producers because they tend to be much more technical than pu'er tea producers. You know, if you meet people, tea farmers from Taiwan or Fujian, you can really talk deep about technical stuff with them. They will explain you the processing step by step, and they have to be much more accurate, much more conscientious, you could say, when doing the tea processing. It's a kind of tea that's easier to mess up than pu'er tea. Because I think pu'er tea, you can always kind of hide some small processing mistakes with a bit of aging. Okay, time heals the bruises in pu'er tea, but it's not the case with oolong tea, because these oolong teas tend to be enjoyed when they are young, unless you go for the aged way, which involves roasting every year. Okay, so these two teas, they are from spring 2020. I'd say you can still enjoy them for 1 or 2 years, and they come in sealed packs, in vacuum sealed packs like this. So we'll only offer them as 100 grams because we want to preserve the packaging, and as long as you don't open them, they won't lose their fragrance. Okay, they won't lose their fragrance much. Of course, don't open it in 10 years because sure, it will probably have turned a bit stale. Because despite having complete shaching and everything, you still have a bit of oxidation and things going on, even though it's vacuum sealed. Okay. The vacuum is never perfect. Okay. We're tea farmers. We're not NASA, so we cannot do like a perfect vacuum sealing. So I could enjoy these two teas for many brews. Now they are at, you could say their apogee, you know. So like oolong tea, usually you get the strongest brew is like the second or the third brew. It really depends on how the leaves open. So really forget about the timer and stuff like that. Just look at the leaves. You can see that these leaves are not totally unfolded. It seems that this one is a bit more unfolded than that one. It could be due to a difference in the tightness of the rolling during the rolling process. Maybe this one was rolled a bit more tightly. And well, if you want to really enjoy the fragrance and stuff, at this point you should make quick brews. Okay, I've been making quite long brews because I'm talking at the same time. And anyway, I got to enjoy this strongly brewed oolong tea. I was surprised because Mr. Huang really brews them super strong, and I was kind of I was kind of very surprised at the beginning when tasting his teas because they were very bitter. But they have that good bitterness, you know, that good, it's not a pu'er tea bitterness, it's again another bitterness. It's not a Laomana bitterness. It's more on the sides of the tongue. But again, it vanishes in a couple of seconds. So that's quite interesting. And I would say as a pu'er tea drinker, I still enjoy these teas. But I give them to my friends in Yunnan, and you know, I think there's no hope for having Yunnan people drinking and enjoying oolong tea. They always say it's too fragrant. It's too fragrant and gives them a headache because it's fragrant. But sure, here we're used to drinking pu'er tea, which doesn't have that kind of fragrance. So, yeah, even my friends who are kind of tea experts, they don't really like oolong tea in Yunnan. And that shows the diversity of tea culture in China, really. I'm sure if you brew pu'er tea to people in Fujian or Zhejiang, they will say that tea is tasteless or something like that. Even though on the domestic market, pu'er tea has been faring very well, and pu'er tea has taken over a big chunk of the market, actually. If you go to like Shenzhen Tea Expo, I'd say 60% of the stalls sell pu'er tea. It used to be a lot of Longjing and Tieguanyin, and now these markets are struggling. They are struggling actually not because of the, well, not mainly because of the taste, but because they got that rumor, especially Tieguanyin, that there's too much pesticides in there. So I think that market is actually a good opportunity for Mr. Huang, because I'm sure a lot of people still love Tieguanyin, but they are afraid, they are concerned with the pesticides, so they don't want to buy Tieguanyin. But this one is certified organic, so that's pretty cool. Now I'm gonna brew those two. So this one is an aged oolong. It's 5 years old, and it's been roasted 3 times, once a year, every year after the production. Okay, so that's quite typical. It's a different style of tea. So we're going to try this. And this one is Oriental Beauty. So Oriental Beauty, it looks very much like Darjeeling Second Flush and tastes quite similar. Actually, the processing is quite similar to Gaoshan Oolong. It's just that they use a higher grade, and they will use the summer flush. Okay, these Gaoshan Oolong, they are made with, you have a spring and an autumn version. Each has their own personality. But you cannot make this kind of tea in summer, because well, the leaves you get are not suitable for it. So what they do in summer is they just pick like one bud, what looks to be one bud, one leaf, and they make that Oriental Beauty. And of course, as a tea enthusiast, I'm sure you're thinking about that insect, the Jacobacia formosana, like the jacid. It's a very tiny insect that you find in most of the tea gardens in the world, and it will bite the leaves. So they are all over the place in summer. They will bite they will sting, actually. They will sting the leaves and leave a little red mark on the leaf. And actually, if you allow, if during the processing you allow a time for oxidation, these red marks will expand. It makes the oxidation faster, actually, in the places where they have that sting, and it brings a specific fragrance. So it's a very interesting tea, very different from any other tea, I would say, thanks to that insect. And yeah, the presence of that insect, it's probably responsible for 50% of that fragrance, what they call the muscatel fragrance in Darjeeling. You can make Oriental Beauty if you don't have insects, but it won't taste as good. You won't really get that specific fragrance. And interestingly, so Mr. Huang told me that in his place in 2020 they didn't get that many insects. And anyway, they don't get that many insects there because of the high biodiversity. They don't get that many jacids. And you can think why. Since they cannot spray pesticides, they have to have a lot of natural predators like spiders and praying mantis, things like that, assassin bugs in the tea gardens. And those natural predators, of course, will control the populations. They will prey on the jacids. The jacids will get stuck in the spider nets. So you won't have as many as in a place which would be at lower altitude, where you'd have just more activity. and which would have a lower biodiversity, a place in which one species would be able to thrive over the others, if only for a couple of weeks. And so the myth is that to make Oriental beauty, you need to have an organic plantation, but it's not true. Actually, pesticides can help because you can spray insecticide, and that will kill the natural predators and will leave room for the jacids to seize the tea garden. So don't think that because you have Oriental beauty, don't think that the garden doesn't use pesticide, okay? And so I was also surprised to learn that Qing Xin Oolong has a decent yield, because the yields I have in mind are more like the Gushu or the natural tea gardens we have in Yunnan. And of course, even though it's a Samika, like the tea gardens we have in Jingmai, it's a Samika, it's supposed to have a very high yield compared to Sinensis. Qing Xin Oolong is a small leaf varietal, it's a Camellia sinensis, var sinensis. But still he gets a decent yield. Well, he has 7 hectares and he makes 7 tons of dry tea every year. So I would say it's more than what we get with a Gushu garden or even a Shanghai garden, but it's definitely much less than the yield you could get with conventional Taidi plantation with a Samika. It's just that his garden is managed quite intensively, you could say. Intensively, not in terms of chemicals and stuff, because they can't spray that, but intensively managed in terms of workforce. You need a lot of workforce to do the weeding. They need to incorporate the fertilizer into the soil, so that means every year you have to till the soil, incorporate his special organic fertilizer, and then you have the picking, and quite a lot of pruning. These tea gardens have a picking table, and they are always pruned, I think twice a year, if I remember correctly. So pruning stimulates growth, and it gives you more standard grades, you could say. If you don't prune your tea tree, you're going to get 1 bud, 1 leaf, and 1 bud, 2 leaves on the same tree. Okay, so that can be important. If you make oolong tea, you'd like to have a more standard grade, maybe. And pruning is also the only way they have to treat serious disease. Okay, because they cannot spray pesticides. In some countries, there are, for example, if you make organic wine, you're still allowed, I think, to spray copper. That Bordeaux soup, that blue stuff, which is made of copper sulfate. That's a good fungicide, which is allowed in certain limits in organic farming. But I think it's not in China. Actually, you'd be surprised to learn that I think the organic certification in China is one of the most stringent in the world. And that actually causes a set of problems, which explains why not many organically certified teas are available, because small producers cannot afford the complicated process of making an organic certification. And I would say that most of the organic certified teas in China don't taste that good. So Mr. Huang's tea is quite an exception in this regard. So if you're invaded by disease, or if your tea tree is if your tea garden is threatened by frost, one of the way is heavy pruning. You just cut all the leaves on the tea tree to prevent the disease from thriving. And it's a bit counterintuitive, but it's better because you still have energy left in the roots, and so you will have a regrowth. While if you let the disease spread to the tea garden, it will actually a lot of disease will end up killing the tea tree, because the tea tree will struggle and use its energy to keep fighting the disease. And so it's better to cut everything. But it probably has an impact on yield. Well, it's a method that's done even in Yunnan. It's heavy pruning. So we have to separate. Pruning has two techniques. Light pruning, the purpose of light pruning is to promote growth and keep the picking table. And the purpose of heavy pruning is usually to manage some kind of crisis, of disease or frost. Okay. Let's talk about the teas. I was quite surprised by this color. No, this time it turns out okay. Sometimes the first brew is a bit pink. It has a slightly odd color, which is due to the roasting. The color of the first brew is different from the subsequent brews. And yeah, you have that roasted taste. That reminds me of Taiwanese-grown. I actually love Taiwanese-grown because they do it heavily oxidized and heavily roasted. This one I would say is a medium roast, not a heavy roast. But I'm gonna try the Oriental Beauty first. Yeah. Interestingly, the leaves look like a poorly processed pu'er tea. You have green leaves with patches of red. So he told me, because he doesn't want to push the oxidation too much in the factory. So basically, Oriental Beauty is processed almost like a Gaoshan, but two parameters will change. You will have three parameters. You will have a longer withering, then you will have a longer oxidation, and usually under warmer conditions. So you will have a stronger oxidation. And then you will have a lighter rolling, because you don't need to roll the Oriental Beauty in balls, okay? It looks more like you could say like a black tea rolling, okay? Well, the main point is the difference in oxidation level. But the thing is, you get the oxidation in Oriental Beauty will be faster than in Gaoshan, because they were stung by the jacids. Okay, so if you have a lot of stings on the leaves, then you will have a faster oxidation. So if you have few insects, you will have less stings and you won't have as much oxidation. And the problem is, sure, you could correct that in the factory. You could correct that in the factory and you could keep oxidizing, and then you would just have a black tea, okay? You will have all of the leaf reddened. But that's not what you want to do. You want to bring out the specificity of that insect biting the leaves. So actually, you still don't want to oxidize too much. So it's more oxidized than the Gaoshan, but definitely not as much as a black tea. And really, the look of the leaf, the degree of oxidation, you can see it's quite yellow. It's still lightly oxidized. It's because there wasn't a lot of insects that year that stung the leaves. And I love that tea because it reminds me of when I started drinking tea, and I would drink a lot of Darjeeling Second Flush. But it's like an upgraded version of the Darjeeling Second Flush. The Darjeeling Saffron Flush is just a black tea with lower oxidation. I think there's no bruising involved. There's no shaching as far as I know in Darjeeling. But it's just that the result can be similar because the insect will bite the leaves. But this one still tastes like good Oriental beauty. You get that fragrance. But here in Yunnan, they don't like that. My friends don't like this, so eventually I don't brew it for them because they don't like it. They say it's just like perfume. Sure, you're not drinking that kind of Oriental beauty to get a heavy mouthfeel. And since it's summer tea, anyway, the mouthfeel will be quite weak in that kind of tea, okay? It's really a tea for the fragrance and also for the, it kind of warms the body. It's not a very aggressive tea. It's a tea that you can overbrew without problems. When I drove back on the way from Jingdong to Pu'er, I just brewed this tea in a thermos bottle and it was perfect, drinking on the road, and you get that good fragrance and a kind of acidity, not really acidity, but a little bite on the side of the tongue, which is very enjoyable for me, but not from my Yunnan friends. And so now this roasted tea. So you got a strong upfront bitterness. This is due to the roasting. They had 3 roastings, okay, so basically it's quite somewhat heavy roast, but the taste of the roast tends to tone down as the tea ages. So that's why it's supposed to be an aged tea. And this tea, you can keep it and it's going to keep changing over time and being a bit more toned down, a bit wiser, I should say. In terms of mouthfeel, I would say this tea is, it's not as complex, it's not as thick as these two. And this is because when roasting, you destroy a lot of compounds in the leaves, a lot of, you basically make the tea a bit simpler when you roast it, okay? And this is why usually heavily roast, the heavier the roast usually, the lower the quality of the base material. And just because it's too bad to roast, I would say it's a bit like editing a picture in Photoshop, okay? If you have a great picture, you don't really need to edit it that much. So maybe you're gonna get a very tiny roast, a light roast, just to get that touch of, that kind of buttery touch. Now, let's say you have a very, a poorly taken picture. You can edit it and kind of make it a bit better, but it's going to be different, okay? Or it could be like adding sauce or toppings and stuff on food. When you have very good vegetables, very good meat, you don't need to do complex cooking actually. But if you have lower quality meat, then maybe it's better to make a stew, add more complex spices and stuff. Okay, you're still gonna get a good meal, but it's gonna be a different kind. I would say roasted tea is quite the same. Usually you won't use your best material to make that kind of roasted tea. But it's fine, the final result is interesting. You get that nice roasted fragrance. Now, I brewed it quite strong, so the bitterness is quite high, but it's just a very different tea from the 2 others. With a lighter mouthfeel, more bitterness, more stuff going on in the nose and in the upper palate. Okay? Now, this is not charcoal roasted. Mr. Huang could go actually into charcoal roasting, but he hasn't done that yet. I think that would be a way to improve this kind of tea further. Although, as I understand, he doesn't make a lot of that tea. So I'm gonna keep drinking these teas. I think that's about it for today. I can see that my camera is running out of battery. So I'm gonna leave you here. I'm gonna put these teas on the website very soon, and I hope you will enjoy them. I really have no idea if they're gonna sell well or not, but I'd like to help Mr. Huang. I'd like to support him because I think he has a great project and very unusual. So yeah, that's it. So thank you for watching and see you later. Bye bye.